Some things are all around us and we don't even know it. Air, unless it moves. Pain, unless it's ours. Mental health challenges, unless we're attuned. Be one who knows about mental health disorders, destigmatizes them, makes and is the difference.
Addiction. It's still a word filled with stigma and misunderstanding. Inaccurate portrayals in movies have blinded our eyes to see that an addiction can happen in anyone's life. Overwhelming stress, unresolved trauma, including childhood trauma, and many other factors can lead us to practice behaviors or consume harmful substances to temporarily numb our pain. But there is hope for a lasting freedom. Adventist Recovery Ministries can help you find the path to life. Join a journey group to experience a Christ-centered 12-step program. Be trained as a facilitator to host a group in your church or community. You can also be trained as a sponsor or equip your church to be a trauma resource center. You can be someone's hope for freedom.
Life is challenging. Figuring out who you are, what you want, and how to get there, there's no instruction manual. Questions swirl in your mind, and you're not sure where to turn. A Rugged Journey is a safe place to ask your toughest questions. You can ask us anything, anonymously, and find solid advice on relationships, anxiety, addiction, self-worth, whatever you're struggling with. Our mentors are ordinary people, willing to join you on your journey in a compassionate and respectful way. The road can be long, but you don't have to walk it alone. A Rugged Journey.
Have you ever felt like you were nearing the point of being overwhelmed? Who hasn't experienced the feeling of burnout? From that place of being overwhelmed, have you felt there was nowhere to turn? As humans, we are very good at hiding the reality that at times we are way too close to our breaking point. In the midst of our overwhelm, we may even receive compliments that we've never seemed stronger, when in fact we really feel like we are breaking. What if there was a safe space where you could bring your brokenness and experience healing? Coming soon, you can engage in 12-step style groups to avoid succumbing to burnout. Be on fire. Avoid the burnout. Be not consumed.
Anxiety, relationships, addiction, self-worth. Where do you turn for answers to life's challenges? Gorgeous to God is a safe space for young women to ask their toughest questions and find their deepest purpose. Our mentors are ordinary people willing to journey with you in a compassionate and respectful way. You are loved. You are seen. You are gorgeous to God.
Most of us know where to go when our bodies are broken, but do we know where to go when our hearts are broken because of loss? At some point in our lives, we all experience the pain of loss and are in need of heart healing. When we lose someone or something important in our lives, it hurts. The hurt is called grief, and it calls out for relief, for comfort and some type of help. Where can we go? Where would you go? Health experts are predicting a pandemic wave of prolonged grief in the aftermath of COVID-19. We can be present for each other in both our joys and our sorrows. It takes a careful and understanding approach. Grief support groups can help. Your community, both in and out of your local church, is hurting. Watch for resources coming soon to help you more effectively lead others through the seasons of their grief. The mission of the Adventist Learning Community is to empower people with the passion and skills necessary to further the kingdom of Christ in the 21st century. Because of technology, we can put training, education, and resources into the palms of people's hands anywhere and anytime. Whether you're a pastor, teacher, church administrator, believer, or Christ seeker, you'll be able to find free courses that you can take for continuing education credit, certification, or just for fun. Our portfolio will help you manage and keep track of your continuing education units for pastors, teachers, and administrators, as well as student learning outcomes for pastoral interns. Our ministerial and educational library puts Adventist resources from around the world at your fingertips. Watch a video, read an article, and share what you find with others. Browse and connect with Adventist teachers that are looking to partner and create academic and faith-based learning projects. Search for project ideas that address real-world problems and create a solution. Follow the steps to guide your class through project-based learning and empower your students to take an active role in learning. Then, share your results. Explore our course catalog and see if there's a faith-based course you'd like to take or a resource you could use in your ministry or devotional life.
Welcome back to the Restored Mental Health and Wellness Summit. We're glad you're here. Erica, we are on day 2 of the summit, and I understand that Dr. Angie sent us off with some homework yesterday. Is that right?
That's true, but it was the kind of homework that was meant for our benefit. I wish that we could ask our attendees how they did, but take a second and just let us know in the chat how that homework went. Dr. Angie asked us to get a good night's rest, to get some exercise, and to count our blessings and share a blessing. So let us know how you did with that. We have a full program this morning, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our devotional message this morning, which comes from Wendy Eberhardt, Vice President for Ministries for the North American Division.
Some things are all around us and we don't.
Good morning and welcome to Restored, a health ministry and wellness summit provided by the North American Division Health Ministries Department. I just want to thank Dr. Brower for all the hard work and the prayer that she put into providing this event for you. I hope that you are blessed over this time that we have together. I want to dive into scripture with you this morning, but before we do that, I'd like to speak with our Heavenly Father. So please join me in prayer. Good morning, Father. As we start this day with you, we ask for your presence. We ask for you to come and be with us, open our minds and our hearts for the message that you have. And as we spend these first few moments looking at your story, we ask that you will bless us and the words that you've given me, Father, take those words and use those to bring honor and glory to you. In your name, I pray, amen. So the story that we're going to look at in Scripture is found in the Gospels. It's found 3 times in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But today I want to look at the story in Matthew chapter 5. The part of the story I want to talk about starts right around verse 21. What's happened before verse 21 is a little bit of a humorous story. We know that Jesus has cast out demons into a herd of pigs, and we know they ran down the cliff and they did some deep sea diving. So we pick up the story just after those pigs have gone swimming and Jesus has crossed with his disciples back across the lake. And what has happened is, just like many other stories that Jesus has given us, when he is there, multitudes surround him. And so particularly a large multitude, the scripture says, has come and they have surrounded him, wanting to be near the teacher, wanting to be near the healer to learn all that they can. Some came for healing from their master. And so they're surrounding him. And as we know, as the story goes, there is a ruler from the synagogue who comes into this multitude and comes up to Jesus. And he has a burden on his heart. His daughter, his child is near death. And he asks the Savior to come to his home and to heal her. And so as Christ and the disciples move and they follow the ruler to his home, along this journey to his home is where this story takes place. Now we know that this woman with no name, she approaches the situation. Now this woman has had 12 years of bleeding, an issue of blood. That's what we hear from scriptures. Now, I don't know what 12 years would be like of dealing with an issue, but she was looking for an answer. She thought maybe if she went to this healer that he could provide her healing. She had been to many other doctors, but maybe this was her last hope. Maybe she was at the end of her rope and she was seeking this healer because she had run out of options. Her 12 years of living ceremonially unclean must have been a level of difficulty that I don't understand and I can't comprehend. I imagine her isolation from her family, her friends, her loved ones. I imagine she might have felt banished by that. Maybe she felt some depression. Maybe there was anxiety when she did go out and get the things that she needed to provide food for her. Maybe there was anxiety about the people and making sure she didn't approach them, making sure she didn't touch things, because anything she touched would then become unclean. I think that she was probably dying for human interaction, to feel human touch. I know that we've experienced some isolation recently, not to the extent of this nameless woman. When COVID hit, the majority of the world had never experienced a pandemic. We'd only maybe read about it before, but here it was in front of us. I remember hearing that day that we were to go home from work. Where I lived in Phoenix, even there was a curfew. This was all new to us, this isolation that we experienced. It wasn't quite like hers. Many of us had our families with us in our homes. But we were isolated. We didn't know what was happening. Things that we had counted on, like Walgreens and Walmart, were closed. They weren't open 24 hours like they had been. The shelves in the stores were empty. The streets where I lived were empty. It was kind of eerie. But we only lived through that for a few short weeks of that isolation, of that quarantine. But we had our families with us. We didn't have a debilitating illness like she had. You know, we were dealing, most of us, with healthy situations. I don't know what it was like for you when our country shut down. In my house, we wondered, what's next? What's open? Where can we go? Do we have enough groceries? I had never imagined that all of a sudden it would be a scavenger hunt to find toilet paper. I remember waiting in line for 45 minutes to get one small package, 4 rolls of toilet paper. Toilet paper became precious. For this nameless woman in the Bible, 12 years, how did she get the supplies she needed? How did she get the food that she needed? I don't think she could wait in line because she couldn't come near people or touch anyone because she was unclean. I can't imagine this complete isolation that she felt. Now, it didn't last 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks like our quarantines did. It turned into a lifetime of being quarantined for this lady, of being isolated. During our isolation and quarantine, my family grew closer. We did more things together. We spent more time together. We took walks in our neighborhood. We played games. We made the most of our quarantine, but this woman had no one to play games with. She had no community. She so longed to be with people. These long days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 12 years. This woman faced this kind of isolation. I imagine that she experienced mental fatigue, maybe mental fragmentation. I think her heart probably ached. She was filled with loneliness. She ached to be around friends, around family, to have good conversation, to have community. 12 long years of a lonely life. Doctor after doctor she had visited. There was no cure. She had tried everything. All of her resources were gone in trying to find a cure. I imagine if it was me, I would have been at the end of my rope, and maybe she was. We don't know all that she went through. We can only imagine. Was this her last attempt to be healed, her last effort? Did she take every ounce of energy she had to go and find the master healer that day? We don't know. We can only assume. The ceremonial laws had given her the status of unclean. She knew she shouldn't go to see the master. She knows she couldn't really come that close. And if she did, would she be allowed to get that close? Would she be allowed to explain what was going on and ask for healing? Her faith made her believe that if she could get close enough, if she could touch the hem of his garment, that she would be healed. Maybe no one would see her. Maybe she could slip through the crowd unnoticed, touch the hem of his garment, and slip away and be released out of her life of isolation. That's what she believed. She believed that he could heal her. And the Bible tells us how the crowds pressed around Jesus. They even used the word choked when they described how many people were in the streets as they were following Jesus to the home of this ruler. Ellen White in Desire of Ages talks about how this woman followed the crowd, and being unable to reach Jesus and being in despair as she watched Jesus move close to her, she thought this was her golden opportunity. But in the confusion of the crowd and the movement of the crowd, she could only catch a mere glimpse of the Savior. And that's when she thought, I've got to reach out and touch the hem of his garment, and I will be made whole. So Ellen White says she came up behind him and she reached out, and she barely touched the hem, the border of his garment, and instantly she was healed. She could feel it. Her body changed. She knew the significant connection in the Jewish culture at the time. Only men wore prayer shawls or garments, and possibly Jesus wore a prayer shawl. We don't know. But there was something significant about a prayer shawl in culture of that time. There were tassels that were sewn on the corners of the prayer shawl. And some theologians believe that the longer the tassel, the holier the person was, because they would take the tassels and they would wrap them around their fingers as they would pray. So long tassels it meant that you had a large prayer life, that you were connected. And I suppose that the Jewish culture at the time, that maybe she thought, man, if I could touch that part of Jesus, I would be healed. This nameless woman reached out and she grabbed a hold and she touched that part of Jesus. Her faith moved Jesus at that moment. She knew that this opportunity to connect her with the limitless power of Jesus would change her life. Now, Jesus, he moved into action when she exercised her faith. And he stopped. The crowd stopped. Right in front of this multitude, he acknowledged her faith, her silent action of faith. He called out her healing. He could have just been silent. He could have let that moment pass. He had knowledge that power had left him. And he could have just gone on his way, and he could have let her move away in silence, but he didn't. He called this to our attention. And he asked the question of his disciples and everyone around, who touched me? Now, I can imagine that people were so pressed to him that he was touched by a lot of people, but this touch was different. And he had to acknowledge it. As they were looking around and Christ was looking through the crowd of people, he finally sees her. She knows she's been found out. There's no way for her to slip away. And so she comes forward, and Ellen White says she's trembling. And she falls at Jesus' feet to let him know that she was the one that reached out and touched the hem of his garment. And I can just imagine Jesus. He wanted to look into the eyes of this woman who had such a beautiful faith. And he wanted to acknowledge what had happened. And he told her that she was saved and to go in peace and that her faith had healed her. Sometimes this means when we ask for this kind of healing, that we have a great burden on our hearts. I imagine it's the same kind of burden that she had. When we come to Jesus to the point of, Jesus, we need your help. And I imagine that day, like I said, I think she was at her last resort, the end of her rope. I know that we don't all have healing like this nameless woman that we need. But we all have healing of some sort that we need. Our hearts need to be brought in oneness to Jesus. Maybe that's the healing that we need. And maybe that's why Jesus called her out and said, your faith is what healed you. And maybe that's why he used this as an example, is that we need to have that kind of faith that we know that we reach out, and if we only are able to touch the hem of his garment, that we are going to be healed. Jesus loves to heal. He's a healer. It does him great joy when we depend on him and we look to him for healing. Wherever we find ourselves in this journey that we're on, we all could use some healing one way or another. And I want to challenge us to remember this nameless one who merely touched the hem of Jesus' garment in belief that he could do what no doctor could do. Jesus always does the impossible. Join me in prayer one more time. Father God, you are the healer. You do the impossible, and thank you for putting this story in Scripture to remind us that even if we have a little bit of faith and all we can do is reach out to you, that you are going to heal us, that you desire to heal us. You desire to bring us into oneness with you and to make us whole. Thank you for the incredible love that you have for us, and thank you for your healing powers, Jesus. In your name I pray, amen.
In shady green pastures, so rich and so sweet, God leads his dear children along, where the water's cool flow bathes the weary one's feet. God leads his dear children along, some through the waters, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the blood, some through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. Sometimes on the mount where the sun shines so bright, God leads his dear children along. Sometimes in the valley, in darkest of night, God leads the song in the night season. In the night season, God leads his dear children alone.
We're going to head now into our keynote presentations. The first is by Dr. David Williams, who is faculty in public health and chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He is also a professor of African and African American Studies at Sociology at Harvard University. Dr. Williams is an internationally recognized social scientist focused on social influences on health. He has received numerous honors and awards, including election to the National Academy of Sciences in 2019. He was also a key member of the team that conducted the National Study of American Life, the largest study of mental health disorders in the African American population in the U.S., and the first health study to include a large national sample of Blacks of Caribbean ancestry. Immediately following Dr. Williams, we will have a presentation by Dr. Daniel Dawes. He is a widely respected healthcare and public health leader, health policy expert, educator, and researcher who serves as executive director of the Satcher Health Leadership Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine and a professor of health law, policy, and management. A trailblazer and nationally respected voice in the health equity movement, his scholarship and leadership, particularly the innovative political determinants of health framework that he pioneered, have resulted in increased policies and laws prioritizing health equity. Professor Dawes' work focuses on health reform, health equity, mental and behavioral health inequities, social and political determinants of health, poverty, and health system transformation.
We will have a question and answer period, so if you have any questions for either of the presenters, please enter them in the chat. We will try to get to as many as possible. At this time, we will go to Dr. David Williams.
It is truly a privilege to join you today and to talk about an important topic, and that is mental health and how the patterns and challenges vary by race and ethnicity. I am going to share my screen so that you can follow my PowerPoint slides as we go through the presentation today. We want to talk about how we can better understand and effectively address the challenges linked to race, ethnicity, and mental health. Now, in the United States and across the world, there are large inequities in both physical health and mental health by socioeconomic status. When I use the term socioeconomic status, I'm talking about differences by income, education, occupational status, and wealth. And in the United States and elsewhere, there are large racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status. So that part of the reason why race and ethnicity matters so much for health and other outcomes are the variations in race ethnicity by income, education, occupational status, and wealth. Let me make this concrete. This is national data for the United States from the U.S. Census Bureau for the year 2018. And I'm showing you the racial differences in household income, median household income by race and ethnicity. I've translated it in a way that you can easily grasp the magnitude of the differences. I'm standardizing on the household income of white households as $1. And for every dollar of household income that white households receive, Asian households receive $1.23. Important to understand this data is to keep in mind that the Asian category is heavily made up of immigrants. Almost 70% of Asians in the United States are immigrants, and they've come to the United States with high levels of education. If we look at the historically disadvantaged groups, though, you can see for every dollar of household income that white households receive, Latino or Hispanic households, I'll use those terms interchangeably, receive 73 cents. Native American or American Indian households receive 59 cents. I'll use those terms interchangeably. And Blacks or African American households receive 59 cents. Again, I will use those terms interchangeably. What is in fact stunning about the 59 cents figure for Blacks is that it's identical to the black-white gap in income in 1978. You heard me correct. In 1978, the peak year of the narrowing of the black-white gap in health as a result of the anti-poverty policies of the 60s and 70s and the civil rights policies of the 60s and 70s, the gap was narrowed to 59 cents. And in 2018, it is still 59 cents. Has it been stuck at 59 cents all these years? No. It got worse throughout the decade of the 1980s, got back to 59 cents in the mid-1990s, and it has been a penny up and down since then. The important point, take-home point here, is that there are large racial ethnic differences in income. They are larger than most Americans think, and we have made less progress in reducing these gaps in income than most Americans think. It's also important to realize that the large racial gaps in income markedly understate the racial gap in economic status. What do I mean by that? Well, income captures the flow of resources into the household, but it tells us nothing about the economic reserves that households have to cushion shortfalls of income. We get that from data on wealth. And data from the Federal Reserve Board indicates that for every dollar of wealth that white households have, black households have 10 pennies and Latino households have 12 pennies. So there are very large racial differences in wealth as well as in income. And what low economic status means, what being low in income and low in wealth means, is that although we are all in the same storm, for example, of the pandemic, we are nonetheless in different boats. Because when you're low in income and low in wealth, you don't have the economic reserves to cushion shortfalls of income. And you can often be a paycheck away from being homeless or being able to feed one's family. Why does this racial inequality that is contributing to mental health problems exist in the first place? What does America think? Well, national data for the United States indicates that most Americans believe that hard work alone is no guarantee of success in American society. You see that across the political spectrum. At the same time, large numbers of Americans believe that blacks would do as well as whites if only they tried harder. That if blacks worked harder, all of the racial inequities that we see would be eliminated. And that is held by substantial numbers of Americans, particularly Republicans, and high number, relatively almost half of independents, and a smaller proportion of Democrats. But what does the scientific research clearly say? Why do these inequities exist in the first place? They tell us that a mechanism of what today researchers call institutional or structural racism, but it's residential segregation, a historic policy that determined where you could live based on your race, is a driver of inequality in contemporary society. I published a paper back in 2001 where I argued that segregation was a fundamental cause of racial inequities in health that we see. John Sell was a historian at Duke University. He wrote a book about the origins of segregation in the US South and South Africa, and he argued that residential segregation by race, that where you lived was linked to your racial ethnic status, was one of the most successful domestic policies of the 20th century in the United States. And someone says, but what does this have to do with health? Well, let's think of what we know about segregation and how it works. Segregation is like a burglar at midnight. It slips into a community. It doesn't trouble anybody, but once it shows up, valuables disappear. like quality schools and safe playgrounds and good jobs and a healthy environment and safe housing and access to high quality transportation and high quality medical care. Research indicates that all of these factors vary by place, by where you live in the United States. Let's look at some empirical evidence. Two eminent Harvard sociologists, William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, studied the 171 largest cities in the United States and said because of segregation, there's not even one city where whites live in equal conditions to those of blacks. And they concluded with this stunning statement: the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the average context of black communities. Now, if you paid attention, that's a 1995 study. Well, have things gotten better over time? Let's look at the work of Professor Dolores Acevedo Garcia of Brandeis University. This is a 2020 paper that was published. She created a neighborhood opportunity index, ranking access to opportunity at a neighborhood level for every county in the United States using a multi-item index of opportunity that had more than 29 different indicators. Things like the quality of schools and early childhood centers, things like the high school graduation rate and the percent of adults with high skilled jobs, things like the median household income, home ownership rate, rate of employment, things like the quality of air and water and exposure to pollution and hazardous waste sites, and resources for health, like green space and healthy food outlets and walkability, for example. These are just some examples of the 29 indicators that she put into this one neighborhood opportunity index. And then she looked at the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And what she found, that 67%, 2/3 of all black children in the United States are living in very low and low opportunity neighborhoods. That's also true of 58% of all Latino children and 53% of Native American children, and for about 1 in 5 white and Asian kids. If you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, who resides in high and very high opportunity neighborhoods? Almost 2/3 of white and Asian kids, and only about 1 in 5 black and Latino kids. So importantly, what she was documenting is that place, neighborhood, is a driver of access to opportunity that shapes access to outcomes in society, including access to health. In fact, research by economists show that segregation is the central driver of the large racial ethnic differences in income and education that we see in the first place. David Cutler is a professor of economics at Harvard University. He did a national study of blacks and whites using rigorous statistical methods. He's able to show statistically, if you could eliminate residential segregation in the United States, you'd completely erase black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce black-white differences in single motherhood by 2/3. All of those striking differences are linked to opportunity at the neighborhood level. One more Harvard economist, Professor Raj Chetty, more recently has done an intergenerational analysis. He's taken census data over many years, and he's asked the question, let's look at black and white children who begin life in households at the same level of income. How well are the children doing in the next generation? And he finds that in 99% of census tracts are large neighborhood areas. In 99% of them, black boys have lower earnings than white boys, even when they started out life at the same levels of household income. Why? They live in neighborhoods that differ in access to opportunity. Black boys do as well as white boys if they are in neighborhoods with good resources, but really few such neighborhoods exist for blacks in the United States today. And this is a 2020 study from Raj Chetty. So what do these data tell us as we try to understand the impact on mental health? They tell us that large racial inequities in economic status that matter for life and physical health and mental health do not reflect a broken system. Instead, they reflect a carefully crafted system functioning as planned, successfully implementing social policies, many of which are rooted in racism. In other words, these inequities are not accidents, they're not random events, they're not acts of God. They reflect the ways in which an upstream structural mechanism of racism, segregation, has produced a truly rigged system in the United States. And what research indicates is that when you are low in economic status and living in disadvantaged, segregated neighborhoods, that leads to higher levels of exposure and greater clustering of economic stressors and psychosocial stresses and physical and chemical stresses. Let me give you one example. This is from a study that I did with colleagues years ago, not national data for the United States, but a probability sample of adults living in the city of Chicago. And we found that compared to white adults, Black and US-born Latinos in Chicago had higher levels of major life events, that's experiencing the death of a loved one or experiencing unemployment, higher levels of financial stressors like difficulty making ends meet at paying your bills at the end of the month, higher levels of work stresses that their job leaves them tired and stressed out, higher levels of relationship stresses, others in your life making too many demands on you, higher levels of neighborhood stress like having your home broken into or robbery, higher levels of work discrimination, higher levels of major discrimination like being unfairly fired or being unfairly stopped by the police, and higher levels of everyday discrimination, just little indignities. So across multiple domains of stress, we found that Blacks and US-born Latinos had higher levels of each individual stressors, but also greater clustering of stresses. If they had one, they were more likely to have others as well. And this is from that study that we did. This is the relationship between the number of stresses individuals have, and we're looking at the number of domains of stress that people were high, from 1 to 5 or more. And you could see as every additional stressor, individuals who are high in one additional stressor, the level of depressive symptoms increase. We call this in scientific research a dose-response relationship. The more stresses you have, the more depressive symptoms you have. And it's a powerful illustration of the role of stress having negative effects on health. And then in addition to the general stresses, I want to elaborate a little bit more about interpersonal discrimination as one type of stressful life experience. Martin Luther King suggested this might be important. He was not a scientist, but we could take his words seriously and test this hypothesis that he offered back in 1967. He said that discrimination is a hellhound that gnaws at Negroes in every waking moment of their lives, declaring that the lie of their inferiority is accepted as the truth in the society dominating them. Now, if this is true, then discrimination would have particularly adverse impacts on mental health. What would be the pathways that would lead an experience of discrimination to health? Well, we've studied it and we've now documented the pathways. Discrimination, of which an individual is aware, can lead to negative emotions that can trigger symptoms of distress and increase the risk of mental disorders. These negative emotions can also lead to biological dysregulation that contribute to indicators of subclinical disease and chronic physical illness. Coping with these negative emotional states can lead to increases in risky health behaviors and also can lead to declines in the utilization of and engagement with the healthcare system. So there are multiple pathways. Let me just illustrate the power of the research on discrimination and its effects on physical and mental health by illustrating with a scale I developed many years ago called the Everyday Discrimination Scale. It doesn't capture all aspects of discrimination, but just the little indignities. How frequently you're treated with less courtesy and respect than others, and you receive poorer service than others at restaurants or stores, and people act as if they think you are not smart, they're afraid of you, they think you are dishonest, they're better than you are. Just little indignities. And what research indicates is that Americans have high levels of exposure to these little indignities. This is a national study done by the American Psychological Association in 2015. using the scale that I developed. And what they found is that 1/3 of Native Americans report experiences of everyday discrimination almost every day or at least once a week. That was also true for about 1 in 4 African Americans, 1 in 5 Latinos, and 11% of whites and Asians. So across the board, these little indignities are experiences that people encounter regularly. This slide, I just want to summarize some of the outcomes. There are more than 400 studies published looking at everyday discrimination and its consequences for health. And I'm even surprised by how powerful the findings are. High levels of everyday discrimination reported by an individual is associated with earlier onset of metabolic syndrome, of cardiovascular disease, of breast cancer, of type 2 diabetes. High levels of everyday discrimination predicts more behaviors like binge eating and smoking and drug use and at-risk drinking, so negative behaviors that have adverse consequences for health. High levels of everyday discrimination predicts more rapid development of heart disease as captured by coronary artery calcification or intermediate thickness, higher visceral fat, higher heart rate variation, higher AFib, higher blood pressure, poorer sleep, quality and quantity of sleep, higher levels of inflammation, stress hormones like cortisol, shorter telomere length, higher levels of obesity, less engagement with the healthcare system, and very relevant to our talk today, higher levels of DSM-defined mental disorders, not just symptoms of distress, but actual mental psychiatric disorders linked to high levels of exposure to everyday discrimination, as well as higher levels of emotional distress, lower levels of positive psychological well-being, and negative changes in personality. So just this slide illustrates the ways in which stressful experiences linked to how we relate to others on a daily basis can have adverse consequences on health. Professor Chester Pierce, an influential Harvard psychiatrist, back in 1970, wrote that what the reader must understand, that the items that the everyday discrimination scale, it didn't exist yet, but these assaults that are captured in this scale, that he called assaults to Black dignity and Black hope, he said they are incessant and cumulative. Any single one, he went on to say, may not be gross. In fact, the major vehicle for racism in this country is offenses done to Blacks by whites in this sort of gratuitous, never-ending way. And he said these offenses are microaggressions. Now, research is documenting these microaggressions have pervasive adverse consequences for physical health and mental health. And in the COVID era, Asian Americans have been increasingly become targets of hate, experiencing verbal harassment and physical assault and civil rights violations and online harassment. And this is close to home for me. I have one of my Asian American students who has told me of just negative experience she's had just walking in the streets in Boston, the city where she was living. And then there are other race-related factors that have significant costs to mental health. One study found that over 70% of Black women in the United States, Black mothers, said they are very concerned that their children might be harmed by the police. And a study of 3,000 mothers in 20 cities found that almost 1 in 5 urban youth, are stopped by the police by the age of 15. And mothers of youth who were stopped by the police are more than twice as likely to report depression and anxiety-related sleep difficulties. So these experiences in the larger society have consequences for their mental health. Another study by Professor Brandisha Tynes of University of Southern California studied African-American Latinx adolescents and found that those who have viewed more images or videos of someone of their own racial group beaten by the police or arrested or detained by the police or being shot by the police in the subsequent year, they have higher levels of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and depressive symptoms. So these exposures in the larger society are taking a toll on mental health. And here is another study that I did with some of my colleagues. We linked a database of every police shooting in the United States over a 3-year window. And then we linked it to data from the CDC on the mental health of the population in every state. And we were able to document that every police shooting of an unarmed Black person led to worse mental health, not just for the family and friends, but for the entire Black population in the state in which it occurred, and that pattern was elevated for 3 months. What research is also documenting, a study done of 15 and 16-year-olds across 37 countries between 2000 and 2018. It has found in 36 of the 37 countries an increase in loneliness among 15 and 16-year-olds around the world between 2000 and 2018. Nearly twice as many adolescents were lonely in 2018 compared to 2000. And what is the point along that line between 2000 and 2018? It's 2012 is the point in time that marked the dramatic increase in loneliness. 2012 is also the year that marks steep increases in the use of smartphones and the internet access globally. So the increase in loneliness is larger for girls than for boys. What am I saying? I'm saying that science is telling us that the psychological well-being of teens around the world began to decline with the rise of smartphones and heavy use of the internet. And then there is the pandemic. Stress and mental health in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. Research is also documenting that stressors linked to COVID-19 are an added burden of stressful life experiences. COVID-19 has aggravated vulnerability to mental health. There has been an increase in experiences of the death of loved ones and grief and loss, of witnessing the suffering of loved ones, of anxiety and fear of getting infected by the disease, decreases in social support because we are socially distancing from each other, from co-workers, from family, from friends, and then there's fear of the virus and uncertainty for many of how best to navigate issues of testing and vaccines and treatment. And as a result, socially and economically vulnerable populations are thus likely to experience more trauma, leading to even more emotional and physical symptoms, such as anxiety and helplessness and nausea and headache, causing them to seek more relief from stress. COVID-19 is also a major source of economic stress on the health of the most vulnerable. Here is a national study that found that 51% of African Americans, 59% of Latinos, 39% of whites said a family member has lost their job or income due to the pandemic. And then another question asked in this study, have you or anyone in your household had trouble paying for basic living expenses in the past 3 months? And half of African Americans and Latinos said that was true of them, and 1 in 3 whites said that was true of them. And among Americans of all races whose income was less than $40,000 a year, that was true of 55%. So the economic stress is an additional stressor that COVID-19 is posing for individuals. There was a large study done by the government looking at the stress of COVID-19 on the mental health of the population. And what this study found was 41% of adults in the United States reported at least one adverse mental or behavioral problem linked to COVID-19, 31% symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder, 26% trauma and stressor-related disorder linked to the pandemic. And here is data on the racial breakdown. We see particularly 41% of Latinos reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression. Seriously considered suicide in the last month. Again, 19% of Latinos, 15% of African Americans reported considering suicide because, again, of the pandemic. Seriously considered suicide in the last month, you see 26% of young people, 18 to 24, and 31% of unpaid caregivers for adults. There's a study that has taken my breath away. It's a study of national data on suicide among elementary school children between 1993 and 2012. And what the study found was suicide rates among elementary school children remained stable over time. But the stable rates over time masked the fact that they were stable only for Asians and Latinos. They declined for whites, and they doubled for blacks. I'm talking about black children in elementary school. I do not know that I knew when I was in elementary school what suicide was. And these data really forces us to ask the question, what does it feel like to be a black child growing up in our society today? And what are we going to do about it? That increasing numbers of black boys and girls are, in fact, committing suicide while they are in elementary school. So what can we do about this? What are our options? The good news is there are strategies to improve mental health. Help is available, and help can make a difference. But we have to take action because there is no vaccine for mental health problems. First point I want to make is the importance of seeking professional help. If I had a heart problem, I would want to get the best cardiologist. It is not a failure of faith if I have a mental health problem to reach out to the expertise that God has given others to use to help improve my mental health. So using health services to address emotional, mental health, and substance use challenges is an important strategy that we must begin with. Here is a national study of the United States of persons who met criteria for major depression, whether they were in treatment or not in treatment. And we found that among US adults in general, 57% of all adults who had met criteria for major depression in the past 12 months, 57% had received treatment. Among African Americans, it was less, 45%. Among blacks from the Caribbean living in the United States, it was only 24%. So the need to seek treatment when we are distressed is an important point that we need to take advantage of. What else can we do? We need to invest in early childhood. Here is a study that was done in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They took children, poor children, 80% of them African American, and at birth, they enrolled them in an early childhood program where they were in a good nurturing environment, got good nutrition, good pediatric care, good intellectual stimulation. Do you know by age 21, those kids who got that program compared to a control group that didn't get it had fewer symptoms of depression, lower levels of drug use, a more active lifestyle, better educational success and vocational assets, and better physical health, all linked to the early enrichment they received in birth through 5. So good parenting seminars, improving outcomes for children is in fact a mental health enhancement strategy. Research also indicates that improving neighborhood and housing conditions with no intervention in health leads to better mental health. Here is a study of the Yonkers, New York, a housing intervention when they took residents of public housing, and by the flip of a coin, some of them were selected to move to better housing. 2 years later, all they did was change the housing where they lived, better quality housing. They had better overall health, less substance abuse, less neighborhood disorder, less violence, greater satisfaction with services, Their physical health was better, their mental health was better, their employment rates were better. Everything was better simply by changing the neighborhood environments. I also want to let you know that the science is also telling us we need to utilize our spiritual resources to build resilience. Here is a study, the first study I did looking at the role of religious attendance and its impact on mental health. It was a study of adults in New Haven, Connecticut. We followed 720 adults over a 2-year window. We assessed their mental health. We assessed the stress that they experienced within those 2 years. And we looked at what changes had existed in their mental health. And what we found is that persons who experience high levels of stress, their mental health had become worse. However, those who experience high levels of stress but attended religious services frequently, regularly, religious attendance reduced the negative effects of stressors on their mental health. So yes, religious participation can provide strength to cope with the stresses and adversities of daily life. That's what the science tells us. Here is another study, a national study of Black Americans that looked at the role of 3 aspects of religious engagement: frequency of religious attendance, receiving support from members at your place of worship, and seeking religious guidance in your everyday life. Each of these aspects of religion reduce the negative effects of the stress of racial discrimination. Research also indicates that forgiving others, learning to forgive others and forgiving yourself, also improves mental health. Not forgiving, Anne Lamott said, is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. Here is a book I co-authored with 2 of my colleagues, summarizing the scientific research on forgiveness and health. And we find that forgiving an offender for an offense and a general disposition to forgive others is associated with lower levels of depression, of anxiety, of PTSD, of anger and stress, and higher levels of well-being. It's actually good for your mental health to practice forgiveness. Lauren Toussaint, a colleague I have worked with in this field for a long time, one of his studies with young adults found that high levels of severe stress predicts worse physical and mental health. Lower levels of forgiveness is linked to worse physical and mental health. But if people were forgiven of both themselves and others, forgiveness took the bad effects of stress on mental health and reduced it to virtually zero. Yes, developing a forgiving response to major stressors buffers or dulls the negative effects of stress on mental health. So if you're not forgiving, you feel the raw effects of stress in an unmitigated way. And there are a range of other additional strategies for managing stress. One is to establish and maintain a routine. Eat meals, go to bed at regular times, schedule a positive or fun activity that you can look forward to on a daily basis or a weekly basis. Take breaks from the news. For some people, the news is stressful. If it's stressful for you, keep informed, but don't have to listen to it constantly. Have a trusted adult to whom you can talk openly and safely. Cultivate an attitude of gratitude. Some research indicates if you can just make a list every day of 3 things you are thankful for, that can lead to reducing fatigue and better mood and better mental health and better sleep. And then get regular exercise. Exercise reduces stress and the risk of emotional exhaustion. Yes, take breaks. Take breaks during the day, and we thank God for the gift of the Sabbath as a mini weekly vacation that we can enjoy. Use health services. I made that point again, but it's worth repeating. Get plenty of sleep. Live life with a sense of purpose. Purpose in life also reduces the impact of stress, and cultivate hope. Hope in God, His Word, His mercy, the second coming. Research indicates that hopefulness reduces the negative effects of stress on health. Let me also talk, before I close, about the importance of building resilience. But what do youth need from adults? Youth need adults in their life who they can talk to who they can trust. They need safe spaces where we can hear from them. I didn't say where we can talk to them. I said where we can listen to them. They need a validation of their experiences if they are sad, depressed, and stressed. Don't tell them to stop feeling that way and to get over it and don't talk like that. Listen to them. Help them feel they are not alone. Point them to resources to cope. And yes, help them to stay engaged. Being engaged in service to others, being engaged in working for social justice actually improves mental health. I'll share with you a study documenting that in a minute. But here is another study about the power of social ties and quality of social relationships. This was a study done in Georgia. It studied Black teenagers at age 16, 17, and 18, those who were high on discrimination as teens, was linked to higher levels of biomarkers, stress hormones, blood pressure, inflammation at age 20. However, this relationship between the stress of discrimination and biological dysregulation was broken if the teens were in good relationships with their friends, their family, and their teachers. So the quality of social ties reduced the negative effects of stress on their health. Here is a study of Indigenous Canadians, First Nations in Canada. This group at the time of the study had the highest rate of youth suicide in the world. And researchers studied 196 First Nation communities. And they found that more than half of those communities had no youth suicides at all. So they were fascinated by this. As a group, this group has the highest rates of suicide, but half the communities have none. What predicted the difference? They found those communities that were engaged and had the young people engaged in challenging the government for titles to their land, to rights of self-governance, to control over their services like education, healthcare, police, and fire, and having a place in the community where they taught the young people their history and celebrated their culture. Each of these markers of advocacy and protest and empowerment and social justice was associated with a lower risk of youth suicide. So having youth engaged in serving others and in social justice activities is in fact a mental health enhancing strategy. I also want to say that researchers documenting the need for holistic, comprehensive approaches. Research documents that exposing our young people to nature, getting them out in green spaces, leads to improved mental well-being, improved overall health, improved cognitive development. Many benefits of exposure to green space, improvements in attention, in memory, in self-discipline, in the moderation of stress, in the reduction of symptoms of ADHD and other behavioral symptoms. And then finally, I leave you with a promise from 1 Corinthians 10:13. No test or temptation that comes your way is beyond the course of what others have had to face. All you need to remember is that God will never let you down. He'll never let you be pushed past your limit. He'll always be there to help you come through it. We need to remember and we need to remind each other that we are not alone. God will never let us down. And with God on our side, we can cope with, we can overcome, we can deal with all of the challenges that we face in our lives. Thank you so much for your time and attention today.
Morning to all my brothers and sisters. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. But more importantly, thank you for organizing an event as powerful and thoughtful as this one. I want to start by acknowledging how this event is so timely, as it comes at a point in time when we are seeing so many suffering, not just from the physiological, but also from the mental, both of which wear down on the spiritual. So today I am delighted to discuss the social and political determinants of health, the instigators, the drivers of many of the mental health inequities that you've heard Dr. Williams discuss earlier today. Let's talk about this for a moment. I have a lot to cover, so let's begin. In fact, just this past February, the American Medical Association, its journal, JAMA Psychiatry, published an article showing the results of a cross-sectional study that looked at over 190 million hospital emergency department visits, where they compared the visit rates between March 2020 through October 2020 and the same period for the prior year in 2019. The results were quite alarming. The findings revealed much higher visit rates to the emergency department for mental health conditions, suicide attempts, all drug and opioid overdoses, intimate partner violence, and child abuse and neglect. The study concluded by stating that these outcomes may be associated with societal, community, and individual stressors associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. The jaw-dropping numbers revealed in the JAMA study parallels the findings of a study that I am leading at the Satcher Health Leadership Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine in conjunction with the American Academy of Family Physicians and the University of Colorado, where we have found that if the United States alone were to address the issue of mental health more equitably, a total of $278 billion could be saved and reinvested in the US economy over a 5-year period. And what's more important, a total of 117,000 lives could be saved in the US alone. And keep in mind, these are pretty conservative estimates. Even more alarming is that these numbers are by no means comprehensive or representative of the entire population, because we were not able to access data for 5.8 million people who represent a disproportionate burden of people affected by mental health conditions. These, of course, include incarcerated individuals, nursing home residents, assisted living residents, homeless individuals, active military personnel, and people who are institutionalized in psychiatric facilities. Imagine with me how much more greater these numbers would be if we could have included them all in this study. From the study, we also concluded that poverty, unemployment, and poor mental health disproportionately affected communities of color. A relationship exists between economic status, mental health status, and racial and ethnic status, all of which have been affected by some policy, government action, or inaction. We also found that American Indians and Alaska Natives experience both lower economic and lower behavioral health outcomes when compared with all other Americans. And when you disaggregate the data, we've also found that low-income families or low-income Latino families had the highest numbers of families in poor health, followed by Black or African-American low-income families. Now, Jesus was exceedingly clear in John 13:34 when he said, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another." As such, when we think about mental health, we should consider how it goes beyond ourselves. We should consider how it can be influential in the health of others, our spouses, our children, our families, our friends, our professional colleagues, our brothers and sisters in Christ, and to society as a whole. Our mental health guides us and is what provides us with resiliency. When we look at this from this perspective, how can we not give it the attention and the importance it deserves? And if we truly believe and know that the body and mind are viewed as the temple of God, then we must do all that we can, utilize all the resources that are at our disposal to ensure that each person is given a fair chance to reach their full health potential. You know, as I think about this period of time, and what it represents, I'm reminded about an experience I had with my younger brother years ago. At the time, I had just gotten my driver's license. My younger brother Patrick and I borrowed my mom's car, with permission, of course, and we decided to visit a new church one Sabbath. Once we got there, we noticed the only seats available were in the very last pew. So we reverently and hurriedly walked to our seats, sat down, and not even 5 minutes passed, and my younger brother, like so many kids do in church, even when the most engaging pastor is preaching or the best choir is singing, starts to nod off. Well, when I looked to my right, I noticed my brother's head bobbing as he was nodding off, so I nudged him and I said in a hushed voice, "Patrick, wake up." His head rose. He turned to me and in a whisper said, "Leave me alone. I'm tired." A few minutes later, his head starts slowly bobbing again. So this time I nudged him even more and I said, "Patrick, you're going to miss the service. Wake up." At this point, he raises his head and voice in annoyance and said to me, "Leave me alone. I told you I'm tired." Now, I do not know how many in the audience have experienced what happens when two younger people bicker in church during a service, but we certainly found out that day when a couple sitting in front of us turned around and shushed us. So not wanting to get into any real trouble, I decided to leave Patrick alone and allow him to sneak in a little bit of slumber. Well, not even 5 minutes passed, and the pastor gets up to the podium and immediately shouted, "Wake up! Wake up! We have to wake up, church!" My brother immediately jolted forward in his seat with his eyes the size of golf balls. He was astonished and embarrassed because he literally thought the pastor was talking directly to him. He wasn't, though. He was talking to the entire church. I tell this story to remind myself and everyone else here that sometimes we all need a serious wake-up call to jolt us into action. And just like my brother's wake-up call in church that day years ago, America has been having a similar experience. Sadly, these wake-up calls seem to follow times of grief in our American history. Nonetheless, it's important to ride this momentum of awakening, if you will, because it is during these periods when we can and have achieved the greatest justice for all in health outcomes. By my count, we are in the midst of America's fourth period of a great health equity awakening. This awakening, or these awakenings, include President Abraham Lincoln's policy to override healthcare, to provide healthcare. My goodness, I'm so sorry. Should I just start completely over?
How do you feel? We can clip parts out, but how are you feeling?
I feel like I should start again. Just
Okay.
start from the beginning. So I have that flow. And what I need to do is I need brighter light because it's not helping me. Hold on.
Okay.
I think that's my problem. I can't see my, all right, let me go.
All right.
Just this past, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'll count down to
mute
3. Tell me
myself.
when I'm good.
Okay.
Just this past February, the Journal of American Medical Association Psychiatry published an article showing the results of a cross-sectional study that looked at over 190 million hospital emergency department visits, where they compared the visit rates between March of 2020 to October of 2020 and the same period for the prior year in 2019. The results were quite alarming. The findings revealed much higher visit rates to the emergency department for mental health conditions, suicide attempts, all drug and opioid overdoses, intimate partner violence, and child abuse and neglect. The study concluded by stating that these outcomes may be associated with societal, community, and individual stressors associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. The jaw-dropping numbers revealed in the JAMA study parallels the findings of a study that I am currently leading at the Satra Health Leadership Institute in conjunction with the American Academy of Family Physicians and the University of Colorado, where we have found that if the United States alone were to address the issue of mental health more equitably, a total of $278 billion could be saved and reinvested into the US economy over a period of 5 years. And what's more important, a total of 117,000 lives could be saved in the US alone. And keep in mind, these are pretty conservative estimates, because even more alarming is that these numbers are by no means comprehensive or representative of the entire population. This is so because we're not able to access data for 5.8 million people who represent a disproportionate burden of people affected by mental health conditions and substance use disorders. These include incarcerated individuals, nursing home residents, assisted living residents, homeless individuals, active military personnel, and people who are institutionalized in psychiatric facilities. Imagine how much greater these numbers would be if we could have included them all in the study. From the study, we also concluded that poverty, unemployment, and poor mental health disproportionately affect communities of color. A relationship exists between economic status, mental health status, and racial and ethnic status, all of which have been affected by some policy, governmental action or inaction. We've also found that American Indians and Alaska Natives experience both lower economic and lower behavioral health outcomes when compared with all other Americans. And interestingly, when you disaggregate the data, low-income Latino families had the highest numbers of families in poor health, followed by Black low-income families. Jesus was exceedingly clear in John 13:34 when he said, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another." As such, when we think of mental health, we should consider how it goes beyond ourselves. We should consider how it can be influential to the health of others, our spouses, our children, our families, our professional colleagues, our brothers and sisters in Christ, and to society as a whole. Our mental health guides us and is what provides us with resiliency. When we look at it from this perspective, how can we not give it the attention and the importance it deserves? And if we truly believe and know that the body and mind are viewed as the temple of God, then we must do all that we can, utilize all the resources that are at our disposal to ensure that each person is given a fair chance to reach their full health potential. As I think about this period of time and what it represents, I'm reminded about an experience I had with my younger brother years ago. At the time, I had just gotten my driver's license. My younger brother Patrick and I borrowed my mom's car, with permission, of course, and we decided to visit a new church one Sabbath. Once we got there, we noticed the only seats available were in the last pew. So we reverently and hurriedly walked to our seats, sat down, and not even 5 minutes passed, and my younger brother, like so many kids do in church, even when the most engaging pastor is preaching or the best choir is singing, starts nodding off. When I looked to my right, I noticed my brother's head bobbing as he was nodding off. So I nudged him and said in a hushed voice, "Patrick, wake up." His head rose, he turned to look at me, and in a whisper said, "Leave me alone, I'm tired." A few minutes later, his head starts slowly bobbing again. So this time, I nudged him even more and said, "Patrick, you're going to miss the service. Wake up." At this point, he raises his head and voice in annoyance and said to me, Leave me alone. I told you I'm tired. Now, I do not know how many in the audience have experienced what happens when two younger people bicker in church during a service. But we certainly found out that day when a couple sitting in front of us turned around and shushed us. So, not wanting to get in any real trouble, I decided to leave Patrick alone and allow him to sneak in a bit of slumber. Well, not even 3 minutes passed, and the pastor gets up to the podium and immediately shouted, "Wake up! We have to wake up, church!" My brother immediately jolted forward in his seat with his eyes the size of golf balls. He was astonished and embarrassed because he literally thought the pastor was talking directly to him. He wasn't, though. He was talking to the entire church. I tell this story to remind myself and everyone else that sometimes we all need a serious wake-up call to jolt us into action. And just like my brother's wake-up call in church that day years ago, America has been having a similar experience. Sadly, these wake-up calls seem to follow times of grief in our American history. Nonetheless, it is important to ride this momentum of awakening, if you will, because it is during these periods when we can and have achieved the greatest justice for all in health outcomes. By my count, we are in the midst of America's fourth period of a great health equity awakening. These awakenings include President Abraham Lincoln's policy to provide healthcare to newly freed Black people and poor white people in 1865, desegregation of hospitals in the 1960s, owing to Medicare and Medicaid legislation, passage of public policies addressing minority health and health disparities, including the Affordable Care Act, and of course, the current momentum under the Biden-Harris administration, which for the first time in US history is harnessing the powerful levers of the federal government to advance health equity for all population groups and address the upstream determinants of health inequities. Unlike the previous three periods in US history, today we are witnessing the acknowledgement and prioritization of health equity by aligning policy, programs, and practices at the federal level, something that had barely been achieved before because it was met with such great resistance. The long arc of history eventually bends toward justice, but as it bends, it can also wobble. Notwithstanding the fact that we have entered a new period in our health equity movement, according to recent articles published in the British Medical Journal and Health Affairs, research is showing how little progress we are making in eliminating racial and ethnic health inequities. Within healthcare and public health, we are awakening, thanks to the groundbreaking research of Dr. David Williams and others, to the ways in which research has falsely looked at race as a biological attribute, rather than as a social construct over centuries, contributing to systems of racism in healthcare delivery, education, housing, transportation, employment, and public health. And at long last, medical, nursing, and public health science are declaring that race is not biological, but that racism has profound consequences for health. To address this unfinished business of healthcare and move the needle of health equity to a meaningful degree, it's going to take greater action from all of us, harnessing the power of collaboration with communities disproportionately affected. So, how do we take advantage of this moment in time in the health equity movement to effect real, meaningful, and permanent change? That is the question that I'm focusing this keynote today to try to begin to answer. It starts with considering what gives rise to the social determinants of health, and more importantly, why have they disproportionately and detrimentally affected the racial and ethnic minority communities and other vulnerable individuals and communities for so long? Further, why do they continue to do so, and what can we do as a community of health equity champions to mitigate and eliminate their negative impacts? Today in North America and around the world, greater attention is being given to the causes of these poor health outcomes, lower life expectancies, and health inequities in minoritized and marginalized communities. It is widely accepted and recognized that the social determinants of health, or the structural conditions that each of us are born into, we live in, we pray in, play in, and die in, affect all aspects of our health and life expectancies. In fact, these social determinants of health, which encompass educational opportunities, housing access, transportation access, food access, and nutrition, and employment opportunities, are widely recognized as contributing and even determining as much and often even more to the health and well-being of individuals than their actual medical care. Think about that for a moment. Let me describe it this way. Imagine with me a river, any river that you have ever seen, that flows downhill with the water finally collecting in a pool. Now, in that pond, we have all of the disastrous health outcomes that are a direct result of health inequities. If you look further upstream from the pond, you will find the social determinants of health that give rise to the health disparities and inequities that eventually flow downstream and collect in the pond. Does everyone have that visual in their minds? Okay, good. Now, most health equity champions are focusing on the social determinants of health, and with very, very good measure. However, we must seize this unique but sad moment in time, in history really, and look even further upstream than we have been at the fundamental causes of social determinants and the resulting health inequities. And that means focusing on the political determinants of health, which sit at the top of the river. By focusing on the political determinants of health, we will be zeroing in on the root causes, or the fundamental causes that give rise to, sustain, and exacerbate the social determinants of health that create and worsen the persistent and devastating health inequities that all of us see, experience, research, and report each year. Yes, these are the very disparities that are negatively and profoundly affecting racial and ethnic minority communities and individuals who live and struggle to survive in the murky and often dangerous waters downstream. The political determinants of health are the reason why much of the outcomes that this country faces and the world alike are not by happenstance. It is the reason why we are seeing such an uptick in emergency department visits for mental health, as I mentioned earlier. It is the reason why there was a staggering difference in the number of uninsured prior to and after the passage of the ACA. It is the reason why many communities in North America are not able to live to their most optimal health levels. It is policy that is at the root of these issues, yet it is also policy that can enact changes at the highest level in society and probably at the quickest pace for the greatest impact of all. You see, while many of the initial policies that were passed benefited one group, it created a disparity for others, which in turn snowballed into a greater disaster. This great disaster resulted in what we see, feel, and live through today. A today that is plagued with more than just discrimination. It is swampy with intolerance, bigotry, polarizing partisanship, and racism that has been embedded in the structural foundation of this country, all through the vehicle of policy. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the nation's health isn't an organic outcome. It is not a coincidence that certain groups of people in America experience higher premature death rates or poorer health outcomes than others. Why? Why is this happening? Why has it been happening? The answer, as I mentioned to you before, can be found in the political determinants of health. The political determinants of health involve the systematic process of structuring relationships, distributing resources, and administering power, operating simultaneously in ways that mutually reinforce or influence one another to shape opportunities that either advance or hinder health equity. You see, these political determinants of health inequitably distribute social, medical, and other determinants and create structural barriers to equity for population groups who lack power and privilege, as I've highlighted earlier. Collectively, the political determinants contribute to the imbalance found in America's scale of equity, affecting the ability of each human being to live most optimally in a society that champions and upholds equality, equity, and justice over disparity, discrimination, and inequity. So how did we get here? How did we get here to these striking inequities in health status and healthcare among racial and ethnic minorities? How is it that inequality gets under our skin, leading to accelerated aging in our bodies and earlier onset of chronic diseases? As I mentioned previously, policy can have a deep and widespread impact. The United States has a long-standing history of discrimination, stigmatization, and inequities across racial lines, impacting systemic health and mental health. In fact, the impact of slavery has been associated with long-term effects on contemporary mortality, poverty, heart disease, maternal and infant mortality, among others. So I want to take us back 400 years. So let's go back to 1641, when Massachusetts became the first colony to legalize slavery under the passage of the Body of Liberties Law, which was later used as a template for other colonies, New York, Maryland, Connecticut, etc., and ultimately became part of the Articles of the New England Confederation. In 1670, this law was amended, and the fate of these captives was sealed when the Body of Liberties statutes included now a slave woman's offspring to be a legal slave, meaning that the offspring would have the same legal status in society as their mother, a slave. From a political determinants of health perspective, it is here when the roots of inequity began to fester and entrench themselves into the fabric of America. It is here where our moral compass strayed from its true north through the aid of policy. Fast forward to 1775. Unsurprisingly, the topic of slavery abolishment was contentious. While some viewed the transatlantic slave trade as an abomination that should be ended and fought for the inherent rights of people, freed slaves in particular, others fought to keep the status quo of slavery alive. After the American Revolutionary War in 1784, with the aid of Benjamin Franklin, the first attempts were made to take action against slavery, petitioning for the newly formed Congress to promote the welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to the people of the United States without distinction of color to all descriptions of people. These acts were the first acts of health equity advocacy aimed towards addressing not only the social, but the political determinants that plagued a population of Americans. Despite noble efforts, however, Congress responded to the petition, stating the Constitution rendered the federal government with no authority to interfere in the internal regulations of particular states. And with that, the health equity movement in America received its first, but thankfully not final or fatal blow. Of course, this comes as no surprise, given that the newly formed republic was still in its fragile infancy, and also given that many congressmen were themselves owners of slaves. To put a finer point on it, over 50% of the men elected to Congress were slave owners, and trended at this high percentage for almost the first 2 decades of American history. There is no doubt that the choices they made in their personal lives certainly influenced the decision of each policymaker to allow for the injustices that followed. Modern day research studies now show a direct correlation to the intergenerational trauma created in these same populations, all stemming back to the early adoption of racist policies and practices from pre-colonial times. But the early 1900s were no different than colonial times. We see this trend continue to be concretized even further, despite the government recognizing that we could no longer continue to develop implement, and enforce explicitly racist policies. Instead, what we observed were racist advocates banding together, creatively and nefariously constructing not overtly exclusionary and discriminatory policies, but rather what we call in the law facially neutral policies. Take, for example, the Social Security Act that intentionally excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers who were largely Black and immigrants at the time, or other facially neutral policies that had a disproportionately negative impact. Another includes the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act, which yellow-lined and red-lined over 200 of America's cities. And like so, racism and discrimination continued to shape America in many other ways. Structurally, the Highway Act of 1956, which authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway networks that would span the nation, right? Routed highways directly and purposely through Black and brown communities, sparing the white, affluent, and middle-class neighborhoods. In some instances, the government took homes by eminent domain with the passage of the Housing Act, which displaced over 500,000 African Americans and Latinos. Undoubtedly, the interstate highway system contributed to the residential concentration of race and poverty, which in turn created physical, economic, and psychological barriers that persist until today. Now, similarly, the poverty tax was and is still a vehicle to exploit low-income households, disguised through sophisticated methods such as higher interest rates on their loans and mortgages, higher homeowners and auto insurance costs for those living in neighborhoods with a median income of $30,000 or less. And in some parts of the country, even higher costs for groceries, according to a Brookings Institute study, which really leads us down a whole other path of food deserts. Now, earlier, I presented to you some facts of the stark reality of the mental health state of this country. And with the dearth of mental health policies that we have achieved in the US, it is not surprising. We need to understand that without mental health, there is no health. Interestingly, even when we have achieved the passage of a mental health law, we have found little effort in implementing or enforcing them, again, resulting in the mental health crisis that we find ourselves in today. In a study that was conducted by my team in 2018, states were scored to see how well we were doing as a country in achieving parity in mental health and substance use disorder relative to physical health conditions. Specifically, how well was the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, otherwise known as the Federal Parity Law, being enforced in order to fulfill the intent of the law. This law requires insurers to cover illnesses of the brain, such as depression or addiction, no more restrictively than illnesses of the body, such as diabetes or cancer. In the study, states were assigned a letter grade of A through F and color-coded green for scores of A through B, yellow for grades of C, orange for grades of D, and red for grades of F. I'm not sure about you all, but if I had brought home a report card like this, what you are seeing on your screens, I would have had some serious explaining to do to my parents. Well, as you can see, only 7 of the 50 states received a satisfactory grade of C or higher. 7 out of 50, with an overwhelming 43 receiving scores of D or F. And Wyoming, for those of you in Wyoming, it's noteworthy for being the only state not to address mental health parity in its statutory code. You see, the truth is that we had the ability to curtail the mental state of America prior to the pandemic hitting, but we failed to capitalize on that. And while the failure to capitalize then is continuing to manifest today, it does not mean that we are without hope. Absolutely not. More importantly, it does not mean that we are without a call to action. It is my hope that my remarks this morning are received and interpreted exactly as they are intended, as a multi-pronged call to action to address the instigators of mental health inequities that have harmed and continue to harm racial and ethnic minorities in this country. I would continue, or I could continue to inundate you with disconcerting statistics about the state of affairs with respect to mental health inequities. Or I could continue to enlighten you about the historical, legal, and systemic harms that perpetuate the inequities in our system. I could even give you a more robust lecture on the social and political determinants of health and opportunities that exist therein for achieving a more healthy, equitable, and inclusive society. But just as my brother needed a wake-up call on that fateful morning to come from someone other than me and to be divinely inspired before he would be spurred to action, or at least consciousness, I think I will instead leave you with a couple of scriptures to wrestle with. In Paul's letter to the early church in Galatia, he says in Galatians 6:2, carry each other's burdens, and this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And in Romans 12:10, he writes that we ought to love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. Those are direct and explicit calls to action for each and every one of us to play our part in ensuring that our brothers and sisters know that they are not alone and that we will stand beside them in their times of need. And that is because we are called to emulate the love that Christ has shown us. To really get this point across, I'm going to leave you with a simple question. In Psalm 34:18, it says, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. If God draws near to the brokenhearted, who are we not to do the same? Thank you all so very much for the privilege of your time. I truly believe that with your help, we will be able to move the needle of mental health equity to a degree that we never dreamed possible. Thank you all so much again.
Two powerful presentations this morning. Thank you for being with us. We apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we experienced. To no fault of the presenters. We apologize to them for those technical difficulties. But we are so grateful that both Dr. Williams and Dr. Dawes are here with us live, and we have some questions for them.
That's right, and we've been monitoring your chats and the conversations that have been happening there. They've been very rich and vibrant. Thank you for your participation through the chat. So we have curated some of those questions for our presenters, and I want to start with Dr. Williams. You addressed spirituality and mental health and the importance link that is there. However, we do realize that there is a stigma still in many of our church bodies. And in fact, some of our attendees even put in the chat that they themselves have experienced when church members have maybe told them that their spirituality needs work if they're experiencing a mental health crisis or illness. In light of what you have shared with us today, how would you suggest that we address this kind of a stigma?
Thank you so much, and it's truly a privilege to be here. It's a special privilege to be in the same program with my dear friend and colleague and fellow believer, Daniel Dawes. So, and thanks for organizing this great symposium. So yes, I want to say that it's not just spirituality. There can be misguided spirituality that has negative effects. I'll give you an example. There's research on this, that they look at how do people cope with stress and with problems and difficulties in their life. And what the research finds is that people who cope with problems by wondering whether God has abandoned them, or thinking that because they have this problem, God is punishing them for their sins or lack of spirituality, that leads to earlier death. It leads to worse mental health. So yes, we need to understand the loving God we serve. We need to understand the provisions He has made for us. We need to use them. But I like the point that Professor Dawes mentioned, and that is Jesus has called us that the key sign that will indicate that we are his followers is if we have love. And we need to have that love and compassion for each other, and we need to share that love in practical ways. The stigma of mental health is a big problem. It's a problem within the church. It's a problem without the side of the church. It's a problem around the world. But we need to understand that mental health is just a part of health like any other aspect of health, and that we need to utilize the resources God has given us, including the professional assistance that can help us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that's really why we need to make mental health a more important part of our conversations, even within our church. So, Professor Dawes, you've highlighted for us how policy can exacerbate and even create or perpetuate mental health inequities. Are there instances where it has actually been used to promote mental health equity?
Great question. And thank you as well, Dr. Bauer, for the opportunity to address my fellow brothers and sisters. And I think the feeling is absolutely mutual, Dr. Williams. I always tell him every time we share the virtual stage, I learn something new every time. So thanks again. The answer is absolutely, but however, there have always been a dearth of efforts, and we certainly have seen that throughout history. The very first time from a mental health standpoint where mental health reformers effectively had mobilized, after a similar movement in Europe in the early 1800s, you saw mental health reformers in the United States working to go around the country to basically record all of the abuses against people with mental illnesses at the time. So if you think today, we're talking about the issue of stigma and how highly stigmatized this issue is. It was even more stigmatized. Back then, if you had a mental illness, oftentimes you were thrown out of your homes. You were left to fend for yourself on the streets. What happened was that they were brought in, rounded up, brought into jail. They were then chained to the walls of the jail, stripped naked. They were beaten. They were treated horribly. And Dorothea Dix and other mental health reformers at the time wanted to highlight this and get the federal government to address the general welfare of these most vulnerable people, the least among us. And so she dedicated 40 years of her life, along with others, to impress upon the government to do right by these people, to address their social determinants of health needs. And finally, they succeeded in 1854 with the Bill for the Benefit of the Indigent Insane. They got that bill passed, and they thought for sure that the stars would have aligned, right? Where they had a president who had witnessed firsthand how traumatizing loss can be, right? He had seen his wife, Franklin Pierce, President Pierce's wife, had succumbed to clinical depression and anxiety after witnessing the tragic death of their only child at the time, their son, in a train accident. So, and he himself became a substance misuser, right? He was an alcoholic. And unfortunately, even having experienced these issues himself and seeing the downfall of his wife mentally and systemically, he refused to sign this landmark mental health reform bill. And instead, he set the federal policy of inaction with his veto, preventing any further policies for almost 100 years in this country to address mental health issues, right? Mental health access, mental health treatments, research, and so forth. It would take, at that point now, 100 years later, for us to have gone through 3 major wars, now going through the World War II, the country after World War I and II was in a serious mental health crisis. And now the country couldn't ignore it. So the mental health reformers at that time, working with the Surgeon General, working with other leaders, realized, wait a second, this is a very serious issue and we've got to address it because it has economic and national security implications. So at that point, they got the first piecemeal bill to advance the cause of mental health equity. It created the National Institute on Mental Health in 1946. Through that effort, the research back then, even until today, have then led to us getting additional policies, piecemeal albeit, right? But But what we noticed was, okay, when you try to push for comprehensive mental health reforms in this country, there is significant backlash. We saw that in the late 1970s under the Carter administration, where the First Lady tried to push for a comprehensive mental health reform bill. They had dedicated all 4 years to crafting this policy. And unfortunately, he did not win that election. And so that bill actually ended up being repealed. And that set us back a few years in terms of mental health. And so fast forward, we had a third major opportunity when we were negotiating the health reform law, the Affordable Care Act, to infuse the most comprehensive and equity-focused provisions in that law to address mental health and substance use disorders. And we succeeded in getting that. So, we're talking about the 12th anniversary of the ACA, and the ACA is notable for many reasons. You heard me talk about it being the most equity-focused health policy. But even if we didn't think about that, from a mental health standpoint, that law was the most comprehensive mental health reform law that we had managed to pass in the United States to really bolster the protections and increase access for people with mental illnesses and substance use. So there have been a few attempts, but unfortunately, we have not leveraged the opportunity and we have not pushed forth this mental health equity agenda in policy. And I'm afraid that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen the resources aligned with the greatest need.
That's very interesting, Professor Dawes, and I think many of us are going to have to sign up for your classes to learn more about this history so we can learn how to make a difference. And I think you're also bringing up a good point, is that we have opportunities to influence the policies as well. And we thank you for the work that you are doing in a very direct and tangible way to do that. I want to turn to Pastor John because you had a question from a pastor's perspective in our final few minutes.
Yes, and this is for either of you. Can you briefly talk about the impact of discrimination on the ability of the church to fulfill its mission?
Let me say a little, and then I want to leave enough time for Professor Dawes to also add into it. What is the mission of the church? The church is here to reflect the character of Jesus, to let people see in flesh and blood what God is like, what Jesus is like, what God's character is about. And that's why Jesus said, this shall all men know that ye are my disciples if you have love. He said we are to love one another as he has loved us. It's a big enough task to tell us to love one another, but when he raises it to the level, we must love others to the same extent, the same way in which he loved us. It really raises it to a powerful level of our obligation. And remember, every obligation comes with the resources that God will provide us if we commit to letting his Spirit use us to do this. So it is anathema to what, it shouldn't exist in the church, it shouldn't exist among believers. I'm reminded in the Spirit of Prophecy, there's a powerful statement I often use when I talk about discrimination. She says that every soul is surrounded by an atmosphere that can be positive or an atmosphere that can be chill and have negative effects. And she says by the atmosphere surrounding us, every person with whom we come in contact with is consciously or unconsciously affected. Every day, we are either in our interactions with others promoting disease or promoting better health. And we need to ask God to use us and to fill us with his love so it will overflow into the lives of others. Professor Dawes.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And I would just add ditto everything that you have said. As I was thinking about that question, it really reminded me of an area that I think needs a lot more focus. And I think Dr. Williams touched on this. But, when you think about the religious determinants of health or the faith-based determinants of health, I think there is a powerful, antidote, if you will, to a lot of these issues based on what science has shown, based on the research that Dr. Williams has been engaged in, right, to show how, the religious setting, our brothers and sisters, when we get together, right, in the spirit of unity, how that has helped to have healing and protective effects on our health and well-being. And so I do agree it is something to be mindful of as we are entering the church. And it really does boil down to love. I think, God's love will help us conquer all of these inequities, quite frankly, and will help all of us to have a more positive experience, right? To lengthen our lives on this earth, to help us, be able to achieve our optimal level of health while we are on this earth. So again, thank you all so much for that. And just again, totally agree with everything that Professor Williams has stated.
Thank you both so much for your time. I hope that you both are able to see in the chat a lot of words of affirmation there. Thank you both for your presentations and this time that you've spent with us. That concludes the first part of today. We're going to be ending the live stream, and we will be back here at 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time. A couple of announcements for registered attendees. You're going to be wanting to click Leave to exit this Zoom, and then look for Concurrent Seminars Gamma to select the one that you want to attend. So you are going to exit out of this Zoom and then look for that link. Also remember, if you are taking youth mental health first aid or adult mental health first aid trainings on Sunday, your pre-work assignments are due today, so be sure to complete that. Thank you all for being with us. Until we meet again, be well.